All right. Hope y'all are ready. We're gonna play one d4. So the last maybe 10, 15 games, we've been alternating between e4 and d4. If you're not a d4 player, that doesn't mean you should be upset that I'm playing something you don't play. It's an opportunity to learn about new positions. And I think that can be exciting. We're going to play mainline d4 stuff, d4 and c4. Let's see what our opponent throws at us. g6. Okay, so Grunfelder King's Indian. Grunfelder King's Indian. Now, of course, there are a million moves already in this position, but let's stick to the main line and play knight c3. Most people at this level don't play the Grunfeld. Yeah, indeed. Black plays the King's Indian. Of course, our move is e4, main line. And after d6, we reach sort of the first tabia. A tabia is a position that is usually reached in an opening, and the tabia is a position where there are a lot of deviations, and it's basically a branching out point that almost everybody reaches in a certain opening. So this is the first branching out point where we can decide on a line. There are 10 or 15 viable King's Indian lines from this position, and I will give you the full menu after the game. But the line that I recommend to most students and people who are looking for a good, underrated, and poorly studied line against the King's Indian, a line that most King's Indian players sort of pass by without looking at too carefully, it's the Averbakh variation, named after the recently deceased Yuri Averbakh, and it starts with the move bishop e2. Now, those of you well-versed in King's Indian theory will know that the classical main line is knight f3 and bishop e2, or bishop e2 and knight f3. In the Averbakh, you immediately develop the c1 bishop to g5. Now, the Averbakh is, I think, very good because it has a very specific idea. Bishop g5 is not just a development move, it's also a prophylactic move. What is it prophylaxis against? An RIP Yuri Averbakh, who was the oldest living GM. Who can tell me what bishop g5 actually prevents? Prevents is too strong of a word, it discourages it. e5, yeah. So the first trap is that e5 doesn't lose the game, but it does lose a pawn and leads to a terrible endgame. I'll show that after the game. So after h6, we have two moves. We can play bishop h4. But if memory serves me right, h6 is not that common because this does create a target which we can later attack. And if I remember correctly, the main move is to drop the bishop back to e3. The idea is to preserve pressure on the h6 pawn. We can later follow up with queen d2. And the pawn on h6 could also serve as a hook for a potential pawn storm. And you shouldn't rule out a pawn storm. If you've seen your fair share of King's Indian games, you know that it's absolutely not automatic for white to bring the knight out and castle kingside. Recently, people have been playing with the king in the center a lot more because the center is so well protected. And if you keep the king in the center, then you have this idea of launching a pawn storm against black's king and just basically going straight for checkmate. G4 and h4 and g5, and there's a ton of games that are incredibly one-sided where white does that and black doesn't know how to react. And if black is not incredibly well-versed in how to fight this pawn storm and these ideas, you know, you're just going to blow people off the board every time. Yeah, of course, now e5 is possible. So the downside of putting the bishop on e3 is that e5 is now possible, but it's not the end of the world. Like, black playing e5 isn't, you know, such a great accomplishment. It's just sort of a typical King's Indian move. Why not bishop e3 for the semi-Averbakh? Well, I think inducing h6 is a good idea for white. This pawn being on h6 rather than on h7 typically favors white. Yeah, now, of course, we close the center with d5. That's the whole point. The whole point of this line is that you close down the center. And by closing down the center, you're basically untying your hands for kingside action. With the center closed, you don't have to divert as many resources to maintaining the stability of the center, and you can focus your attention on the two flanks. All right, so d5 is on the board, and a5 by our opponent, which is another very typical King's Indian move. The idea, of course, is to prevent b2, b4, and typically a5 is followed up with a classic knight maneuver to c5, either through d7 or through a6. Black is heading for c5 with the knight in order to put pressure on the e4 pawn and just position the knight on a good square. So again, another branching off point. White has several ways to approach this position, but I think it's very much in the spirit of the Averbakh, the semi-Averbakh, to go directly for black's throat. And we're going to make a move that, if you haven't seen too many King's Indian games, will look totally wild to you. It'll look completely in violation of opening principles. It'll seem like a coffeehouse move, but in reality, it's usually the computer's top suggestion in these types of positions. And that is not h4, although h4 is also very much possible, but directly g4, g2, g4. No, f4 is bad because that allows black to open up the center and activate the bishop. So you almost never go f4 with white in these types of positions. Full send, g4. Let's go. Let's go. So a couple of things. What is the idea of g4? Well, the idea of g4 is pretty obvious. We are trying to send our pawns at black's king, open up the h file, ideally, and use the h6 pawn as a hook. And when I say that word hook, I hope everybody knows what I mean. It's a pawn that's advanced past its initial square, which can be used as kind of dynamite to explode an open file and make it easier to open a file. Otherwise, it would be a lot harder to open the H file and it would take a lot longer. So a couple of things that we're going to have to be mindful of. One is we want to make sure, mental note to self, keep the e4 pawn protected. If black's knight lands on c5, we are going to want to play the move f3 in order to solidify the e4 pawn. The last thing we want is to lose our main anchor pawn on e4. If the center opens up, then our entire strategy is going to come crashing down. So the success of g4 and h4 is fully contingent on us being able to keep the center as closed as possible. And that's why if you're on the black side of these types of positions, one very common idea that not everybody knows is to push the c pawn up to c6, trying to chip away at white center and open up the queen side a little bit, maybe prepare a later queen b6. Black cannot fall asleep here because this attack is coming really, really quickly. What about taking the knight on c5? So hint, piece of advice, you almost never take the knight on c5 in the King's Indian with the dark squared bishop. There are situations where you do, but in maybe 80% of cases, it's a very bad idea to give up your dark squared bishop. Why is that? Well, it should be clear why that is just from looking at this position. The dark squared bishop is an integral attacking piece. It's a piece that lords over the entire position. It's controlling squares on the queen side. For example, after c6, it's preventing the queen from coming to b6. That's a good defensive role. But most importantly, it's supervising the kingside pawn storm. It's controlling the g5 and h6 squares. It makes h4 and g5 a lot more effective. It allows us to play g5 if necessary without h4. So the bishop is just fulfilling a ton of important roles. It's a Swiss Army knife. And giving it up not only weakens the dark squares tremendously, but as I'll show you after the game, when the d-pawn captures on c5, it gives black the d6 square, which could be used for the other knight. Now, I've beaten plenty of players who give up the dark squared bishop for the knight on c5. Knight a6, indeed. Knight a6, indeed. Okay, so do we need to prevent the knight from coming to c5? No, that's exactly what I was just explaining. It's okay for the knight to come to c5 because we can protect the e4 pawn with f2, f3. So we can continue our kingside campaign with the move h4, launch the second pawn. Why not g5 immediately? Yeah, g5 immediately would have been also very good. g5 immediately would have also been very good. I agree completely. But the added benefit of playing h4 is that after g5, h takes g5, we can take back with the h pawn and open up the h file. Knight d7. All right, so now, well, what do we do now? Now we have another pretty pleasant choice. We can most certainly play the move h5. And then black is going to close down the king side with g5. And that may seem like a bad thing for white, but in fact, from a positional standpoint, it's not, because after h5, g5, the square on f5 becomes a gaping weakness. And we can try to bring our knight there. That becomes a very much coveted outpost for the knight. So what do we do now? We can play queen e2, we can play h5. Let's weigh the pros and cons of each. So if we play queen d2, black is going to respond with king h7. Then we can try to... the problem is that it's very hard to open the king side. Knight d7 was a very smart move. So after queen d2, king h7, it's a classic situation where if we play g5, then black plays h5. If we play h5, then black plays g5. So the best thing for us to do, I think, is to switch from tactical play to positional play, and to, in fact, play the move h5, induce g5, and then try to get the g1 knight around to f5. Sounds like a very hard thing to do, but there is a typical maneuver in such positions that allows us to do it pretty efficiently. We go knight f3. Notice that we're exploiting the temporary fact that the knight on d7 blocks the bishop, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to go knight f3. Also notice, we're deliberately not putting our pawn on f3, which would make it a lot harder to navigate this knight over to f5. So our overall strategy is going to be the following. We are going to get the knight to g3. Presumably, black is going to move the knight away from d7 so that the bishop controls the f5 square. We're going to wait for the most opportune moment to put the knight on f5. But in the meantime, we are going to switch the center of our attention from the king side to the queen side. And one of the biggest misconceptions in the King's Indian from the white side is that white can never attack on the queen side. You think in the classical variation, white attacks on the queen side, black attacks on the king side. But in these Averbakh lines, most people think that if they don't succeed in checkmating black on the king side, then we're somehow screwed and black is going to murder us on the queen side. Totally not true. In fact, white has the superiority kind of on both flanks. Knight f6. So as we predicted, black moves the knight out of d7. What do we do now? Well, we make a move that suits both purposes. We play knight d2, and then we play knight f1 and knight g3. Notice again that the pawn on g4 is very well protected. Okay, knight c5. So now that we've gotten the knight out of g1, we can play the move f3 very safely because we're not interfering in the knight's path from f1 to g3. Does that make sense? Notice that queen c2 would have been a blunder because we would have taken our eyes off the g4 pawn. So there's an order of operations here, a sequence of moves that you have to follow carefully so that everything, the machinery of the position works to perfection. Are we worried about our king safety? Again, we're not worried about our king safety as long as we can keep the center closed, because it doesn't matter whether we have pawns around our king or not. If the center is closed, black doesn't have the tools to approach our king. So our next two moves are very likely, yes, c6 is very good. Our opponent is doing everything you're supposed to do on the black side here, but weakening the f5 square generally means that black is going to be worse for the rest of the game. Do we need to react to this? Do we need to play d takes c6 or bishop takes c5? No and no. Again, white's job is to keep the center closed. Black's job is to try to open it. It's not c6 and c takes d5 doesn't really do all that much to open the center. We can safely continue with our overall plan and continue getting this knight around to g3. Why don't we take the c5 knight? Well, I explained that a little bit earlier. All right, and I'll talk about that more after the game. We just generally don't want to give away our dark squared bishop and create permanent weaknesses on the dark squares. This bishop is going to be a very important piece, trust me. Hopefully, I'll have a chance to demonstrate that in the course of the game. C takes d5. An interesting moment occurs here. We're going to take back with the c pawn and keep the structure symmetrical, but there are certain conditions under which you can consider the move e takes d5. There are certain conditions under which you consider e takes d5, mostly if you have the e4 square under control. The flaw in e takes d5 here is that black can advance the pawn to e4, not only opening up the center, but also reopening the dark squared bishop, and that is the last thing we want to allow, so we play cd. Now you might say, well, okay, the c file is now open. Doesn't black benefit from that? Can't black play like bishop d7 and rook c8? Yeah, that's generally what black does in these types of positions. But our queen side is perfectly well defended. It's not that if black gets a rook to c8, anything cataclysmic happens. Why not take with a knight? Mostly it's just because the knight on c3 is also a very important piece. Why is it a very important piece? Well, among other things, it is discouraging and preventing black from pushing the pawn out to b5 and launching a pawn storm of his own. So the knight is just a general anchoring piece. It's defending e4, it's protecting d5, it's defending the b5 square. It's a good piece to keep around. Bishop d7. Okay, this does not threaten the move b5 just yet because we have 2 defenders on that square. So what can we continue to do? Well, we can continue to carry out our main plan and put the knight on g3. And finally, after like 7 moves, we have accomplished our main idea to put the knight on g3. Now, what sorts of long-term things do we need to pay attention to here? Well, our top goal, our most, the top item on our wish list is to exchange what pair of pieces? Who can tell me what minor piece exchange favors white tremendously? What is our top goal? Yeah, not the dark squared bishop. No. The dark squared bishops, this bishop is terrible. It's a big pawn. The light squared bishops. If we can trade the light squared bishops, we will be able to put an uncontested knight on f5, and that is a huge deal. A knight on f5 in these types of positions, it just will terrorize black's position. Queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn. We need to defend that pawn. What is the best way to defend it? I know a lot of you are probably tempted to play b3, but b3 creates a pawn hook on the queen side. It allows black to stir up some unpleasant complications with a4. It also loosens up the knight on c3. We don't want to do that either. We want to play the move queen d2. Nice, harmonious, connect the rooks, defend the bishop. Queen d2 accomplishes a lot of good things at the same time. You should also keep an eye out for bishop takes g5. I know some of you pointed this out earlier. I was impressed. Bishop takes g5 is a frequently missed tactic in these positions because black starts assuming that the king is always going to be safe. Bishop takes g5 could lead to a quick checkmate. After h takes g5, h6, I don't think it's a threat just yet, although it is a borderline threat. Like, we could consider it if black isn't careful. So, of course, black can play knight h7 and protect g5. We're not winning this game in the next 3 moves. What is the next set of things that we want to accomplish? Well, we need to look at our position and identify the things that are not working perfectly and try to make them better. One of the things that I think we can improve is the positioning of our king. Is our king unsafe? No, but there is a very nice square for the king such that the king is out of the way and we don't have to worry about the king catching secondhand smoke from when the queen side opens up. And that square is g2. Yeah, we can put it on f2, but when the king is on f2, it's still susceptible to these tactics related to knight takes g4, knight takes c4. I'm talking here in the long run. You have to understand this, because if you're thinking, what do you mean? The g4 and e4 pawns are well defended. We're talking here about 10, 15 moves down the line. Rook a c8. Okay, well, we can start journeying our king out to g2. And the reason that I want to do it through f2, by the way, is that I want the rooks to be connected. If something happens and we need to bring our rook into the game urgently, we can do so without playing king g2. Of course, we are forfeiting our ability to play bishop takes g5 because we're temporarily putting our king in harm's way. Why not castle? Great question. We can still castle, but I want to leave open the possibility of bishop takes g5. I actually want this rook to stay on h1 in order to make bishop takes g5 a long-term possibility. And in such positions with a closed center, you want to apply maximum pressure, which often means you want to keep open the possibility of certain tactical ideas to keep your opponent on their toes. Wasn't bishop takes g5 winning? I don't think it was. Bishop g5, h g5, I didn't see a clear follow-up. We could have maybe tried bishop g5, but I think we might have the opportunity to do so later in the game. a4. Okay, so here, what black probably wants is to play a3. a3, what does a3 do? a3 essentially induces b3, which, as we've already discussed, loosens up the knight on c3. And why is it bad that the knight on c3 is loose? Because there's a rook on c8, and black can make a move like queen b4. And if you're experienced in these positions, you will know that there is a very nice way to prevent black from playing a3, to take the sting out of it. Does anybody see what move I'm talking about? So if you think about it, if black plays a3, we want to meet that move with b4, pinning the knight on c5. So if we play a3 ourselves, I totally understand where you're coming from, but you're creating a gaping hole on the b3 square, which is okay. But after a3, there are tactics where black plays knight b3 immediately, counterattacking the queen. So the subtle move here is rook a to b1. Again, you might, how do I find a move like this? If you're experienced in these positions, this is a move that is sort of second nature, with the idea of meeting a3 with b4, and that wins the knight. This move is necessary because we need to protect the b4 square. So the way I see this game going, queen a5, very good move. Our opponent is demonstrating extremely keen knowledge of King's Indian ideas. But now, I think we are almost ready to play bishop takes g5. I think we need to consider it here. Let's think about bishop takes g5 for a hot second, shall we? Let's calculate. Hunker down. This is going to be complicated, but I think you guys can handle this. Bishop takes g5. H takes g5. h6, which is, of course, the main idea. And after bishop h8, the problem in that position is that if we take on g5 with check, the black king can find a very nice hiding spot on h7. So we need to somehow open up the h file so that the other rook on b1 can later jump into the game with rook h1. So I am heavily implying a particular kind of move. This move occurs after bishop g5, hg, h6, bishop h8. Yeah, we have to play h7. Black is forced to play knight takes h7, and there I think we have a critical move. I think we have a beautiful follow-up move, which wins the game for white in that position. So I think we can safely go for bishop takes g5. I think we can safely go for bishop takes g5. Note also that I briefly considered knight f takes e4 check. I just made sure that black doesn't have any crazy shenanigans with knight takes e4. The counterplay, well, the counterplay comes too late, right? The counterplay is coming too late. Black, with the move queen a5, black essentially indicates that he wants to push the pawn down to b4. And there isn't enough time for that. We're already checkmating the black king here. All right. H takes g5. And, of course, we play h6. Of course, we play h6. Bishop h8. h7 check. Again, why not queen takes g5? Very tempting move. Because the king hides away on h7. I think even there... Oh, wait a second. Wait a moment. Just give me a moment. I actually just spotted a cool idea. Give me a second. Let me try to calculate it. Because if this works, it's like an immortal concept. But I don't think it quite does the trick, and I don't think it's necessary. I think h7 is a much simpler way to win. I'll show you what I was thinking after the game, but let's stick to our guns. h7, and rook takes h7. Without this move, the entire combination would fall apart. What was a necessary component of this entire combination? It was actually putting our king on f2, folks. Without the king being on f2, this would not work. Why? Who can tell me what the best move is now? Is it rook h1? Is it something else? It's not rook h1. Why is it not rook h1? Because black can play king g6 and defend the pawn on g5. So as tempting as it is to deliver a check here, no. We play queen takes g5, cutting the king off the g file. And on the next move, we drag our rook over to h1 with checkmate. The black has only one way to stave off mate. That is to somehow intercept the queen's access to g8. There's only one move, which is bishop g7. But there the win is very simple. We play rook h1, force the king back to g8. And who sees the winning move in that position? This is very, very nice. Yeah, knight h5. Excellent. Note that in that position, we're not only threatening queen takes g7, but also threatening knight f6 mate. This one is over. What's crazy is that after h6, I'll let you guys in on a secret. I spotted a crazy defensive resource for black. I actually think black could have held on with a ridiculous defensive resource, after which black is still much worse, but maybe surviving. And we'll get to this moment in the post-game analysis. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Anyways, we can also start with knight h5. There's nothing wrong with that. We can also start with knight h1, knight h5. But I think this is more precise. It leads to a more forcing mate. And it's all over. Knight h5. Knight h5. And the game is over. There's 2 mate threats. All that black can do is give us a meaningless check on d3 or on e4. It doesn't change anything. The white king is perfectly safe, resigns, and we win. Great game. Great game. Only 27 moves, and yet a lot of things to talk about. Hopefully this wasn't too bad of an alternative to playing Magnus. All right. So let's analyze. King's Indian, e4, d6. To give you a sense of how many variations you have to know if you want to play the King's Indian successfully with black. So in approximate order of popularity, the main line is knight f3 and bishop e2. This is what's called the classical main line. It's also called the orthodox variation. And you might be familiar with this even if you're not a King's Indian player. Black plays knight c6, d5, knight e7, and this is the start of a ridiculous amount of theory. Hopefully most of you are familiar with this position. There's the bayonet attack with b4. There's knight e1. You know, we could spend hours on that position alone. Then there are lines that are almost as popular as the main line. There's the Makaganov variation, which is an early h3. This move h3 can be played in like 50 different positions, and all of them lead to different lines. So for example, you can play h3 and bishop g5. You can play h3 and bishop b3. You can play h3 and knight f3, and all of these are different. And the theory of these lines are different. You could play the 4 pawns attack with f4. Very reputable line, dangerous if black doesn't know what to do. f3 is, of course, the same-ish variation. I have been playing this in previous speedrun games. There is the Yasser Seirawan variation, bishop d3. There is the Andrew Tang line, knight ge2. And you could play f3 and transpose into the same-ish, or you could play an independent line and get the knight over to g3. I have faced this line myself more than once. And then there are a bunch of new lines. There's bishop e2 and bishop e3, which Hikaru has been playing successfully. This is a line that has taken the chess world by storm. Almost everybody is playing this with white against the King's Indian. This is all of the fashion. I don't necessarily think it's the best line against the King's Indian, but you guys know how fashion works. It's like Hikaru plays a line or MVL plays a line, then everybody's playing it. And bishop e2, bishop e3 is a very venomous continuation. And of course, there's the Averbakh. So that's already something like 8 or 9 lines. And the Averbakh, it has been around for a very long time. It's an old school line, and it's one of those variations which doesn't receive too much coverage in King's Indian books. It's not too well analyzed by people, and it's very dangerous. I've faced the Averbakh several times, and I've gotten worse positions basically every time as black in the King's Indian. A little bit of history. The first time that the Averbakh was played was in the year 1930 by a guy named Eric Anderson. Averbakh was the 5th player to play it. Averbakh played it in 1952 and in 1953. It was also played by a Yugoslav grandmaster, Borislav Ivkov, in 1951. So a lot of good players played this line in the 50s. And it's been around for half a century. And the main point of this move, as I explained, is to prevent e5. e5 is bad because after de, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, you have which move? Who can tell me what the move is here? And white scores 81%. This wins the exchange. Yeah, knight d5. Knight d5, of course, is the whole point of the line. And black is in huge trouble. Huge trouble. Either you lose an exchange, or you can play knight b to d7, but now you lose a pawn with a terrible position. If memory serves me right, white can also castle. Just look at the pressure on black's position. This is horrible. So a lot of people miss this. A lot of people aren't aware of this. And so you can win a lot of games just like that. So for this reason, the most popular way to play against the Averbakh is either to prepare the move e5, and the way that people typically prepare it is to slide the queen to e8. This move should make perfect sense to you. You're preparing e5, you're getting out of the pin preemptively. But also, it's very popular to strike with the Benoni idea and play c5. If you're a King's Indian player, you have to be comfortable, in some variations to play c5 rather than e5. And after c5, white plays d5. Here, there's the Benko gambit idea with b5. This is not a good line. White is better here. And there is the move. There is the move e6, which is what a lot of modern books recommend. But I've analyzed this very carefully, and I always feel like black is a little bit uncomfortable here. So anyways, we won't get too bogged down in theory. h6 is a viable move, but after bishop b3, I think white is already considered to be better. So e5, d5, a5, this is all standard fare. And g4, I'm checking, reference is not the main line. The main move here, according to Opening Explorer, is in fact the more traditional knight f3. But the problem with knight f3, let's not get too bogged down in theory, is that black has knight g4, and black can quickly push through f5. This is why I don't like playing the early knight f3. I think g4 is more in the spirit of this variation, in my opinion. So g4, knight a6, h4. Some of you were pointing out that g5 is an interesting alternative. It most certainly is. hg is forced. We play bishop takes g5, and now you shove the pawn down to h5. I think white is better here as well, but often it's not as simple as it appears. Black has counterplay of their own. For example, black can play the move c6 here. And if you play h4, the queen comes out to b6, attacking b2. And if you play queen d2, the knight's coming to c5. So it's not as one-sided as it might seem. Black has ways to quickly engineer queenside counterplay. Why is h takes g5 forced? Because if you move the knight, I take on h6 with devastating effect. In any case, knight a6, we decided on the more traditional h4. Thank you, Ben, for the raid. And knight f6 to d7. A good move. There are still 2 games in the database at this point. A 2500 against a 2100 in correspondence, and 2 2300s have faced this position. We play the move h5, and this, I think, is the move that most people would struggle with, to find. Because once h4 and g4 is on the board, you think, okay, I want to checkmate black. But in the King's Indian as white, you want to be able to switch gears from tactical to positional. As I explained, the idea of h5 is to create a massive weakness on the f5 square. And I learned this lesson the hard way. I had a game all the way back when I was 1800 where something very, very similar happened, and I spent the rest of the game suffering, even though I held a draw. I spent the rest of the game suffering. Here is that game. All the way back in 2005. So, all the way back in 2005, I had, okay, bishop d3. This is the Yasser Seirawan variation. And watch what happens. Bishop c2. Now he castles kingside, which is a slightly different kind of line. And here I decided to play g5. That was a big mistake, right? This is a very instructive mistake. In the King's Indian, you normally don't go g5, you play for f5. But I didn't know this. I was still inexperienced. Knight to h2 to prevent the move g4. b3. And then he goes g4 himself. And I was so surprised seeing this move. What is this guy doing? He's castled kingside, and he's playing g4. But because the position is so closed, it's incredibly hard for black to exploit the move g4 thing. King h8, and who can tell? Well, I guess the notation is on the screen. Knight f1 and knight g3, just like we did in the game. He puts the knight on f5, and I spent the rest of the game struggling immensely. White was completely winning in this game. So this is a standard idea in the King's Indian that you have to be well aware of. Ben with a sub. And we basically do the same exact thing in this game. We play knight f3. Then we play road to fm. Thank you for the sub. Then we play knight d2. Then we play f3. We literally just execute the plan like a monkey. We get the knight around to g3. c6, knight f1, cd, cd. Bishop d7, we get our knight to g3. The concept here is the importance of appreciating long-term factors in chess. Okay, because you look at this, you say, okay, but I can't get my knight to f5. Black plays bishop takes f5. But that's not the only important thing in chess. You have to also think, okay, but if the light-squared bishops at any point disappear from the board, I'm going to have a potential game-winning asset in hanging over the f5 square. So this idea of putting pressure and concentrating on the short term as well as the long term. Also notice that b5 is not possible, and bishop b5 would have been a serious candidate move on the next move if our opponent hadn't gone queen b6. El Duderino, thank you for the 11. Queen d2, rook a c8, and now the game-winning plan. Deciding to get our king over to g2. We play king f2. The plan was we get our king to g2, we make sure it's safe, and then we turn our attention over to the queen side. Is a4 here a move? I don't like a4 because it weakens the b3 square. I don't see the point in making a weakness this big. Thank you, the Chess Nerd Live. So we play king f2, and after a4, we play this very important prophylactic move, rook a b1. The idea is to meet a3 with b4. That would win the knight. And after queen a5, I made that point a couple of moves ago. In such positions, you have to always be aware of potential tactics. And this is a big reason why people don't see tactics, is they assume that just because something doesn't work in one position, you can stop considering it. But you have to make mental notes to yourself throughout the game and say, this is something I want to consider. This is something I want to consider. And basically on every move, you want to reconsider whether the tactic works. That's what I did here. And we found the perfect opportunity for bishop takes g5. So yeah, after h6, I realized that I had missed a beautiful counter tactic. I realized that I had missed a beautiful counter tactic. This counter tactic involves creating space for the bishop on g7 by sacrificing this knight with check. That's, by the way, why the king would be so much better placed on g2. I pointed this out during the game. And after fg bishop f6, somehow black is still surviving. Knight h5, the bishop drops back to d8. Maybe white is winning here somehow, but I actually don't think so. I think black is doing all right. So it's entirely possible that the best move would have indeed been to play king g2 first. Wait for black to play b5. I was getting anxious about this, but this is not dangerous. Even if black plays b4, we can just continue grabbing stuff on the king side, and this is completely winning. Bishop takes h6, bc, and queen g5. So this is all very, very straightforward. So we should have waited. We should have played king g2 and patiently carried out the entire plan before grabbing on g5. Computer claims equal. Yeah, bishop takes g5 is a serious mistake. The computer gives plus 1.5 after king g2. And apparently rook a8 here, or king h7. And white is clearly better. We can also try to trade queens by dropping this knight back to d1. We can drop the knight back to d1, trade queens, and then try to get this other knight around to f5 as well. So king f2, yeah, bishop g5 is a mistake. hg, h6, and it is because of knight takes g4 check that this idea was, believe it or not, premature. White is still slightly better after king g2. I mean, we still have a lot of assets here. We can go rook f1 and knight f5. So it's not like this is all that great for black, but it was a little bit impatient. But after bishop h8, h7, the game is over. Knight h7, rook h7. The last chance for black would have been to play a move like f6. But after rook h1, can you really blame black for not wanting this position? And guess what? Guess what the best move is here? It's actually bishop b5. That old idea I mentioned now sacrifices a piece, but the knight is so powerful that this would have led to a winning position. In any case, king h7, queen g5 ends the game immediately. Bishop g7, rook h1, knight h5, and mate is unstoppable. So takeaways from this game. The Averbakh is a very underrated weapon against the King's Indian. It prevents e5. Do not be afraid to push pawns on the king side with your, and do not be afraid to keep your king in the center when you feel that the center is closed and it's very difficult to reopen. And then this g4 h4 idea is very dangerous in the King's Indian. But then switching gears from tactical play to positional play. We played g4 and h4 in order to try to deliver checkmate. But once the knight moved away from f6, we realized that checkmate isn't very possible. And so we switched to positional gears. We weaken the f5 square, we get our knight around, and we very patiently nurture the advantage. Hopefully you found this game useful. Hope you enjoyed. And I'm going to call it a day here, folks. So thank you for watching. Thank you, everybody, for the support. And that was a nice game. I really like the way that I've been playing the last couple of speedrun games. We've gotten a lot of instructive content out. One more shout out that I do have a YouTube channel, and every sub counts. So if you like the content, you like what I do, you would be doing me a massive solid by throwing your name in the ring and subscribing. We're trying to reach 300K. So I'm far from the biggest channel, but, I do my best. It's a two-man operation, and, just want to thank everybody for being awesome and super supportive, and the comments are always massively wholesome and make my day. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. See everybody later. Bye.